What's the real story? How did all of this come to be? Was it all by chance, or did something or someone design everything? Join us as we learn from our host, William Henry, and discover that the story of the Earth and our universe is really his story.
Welcome to Discovering His Story, a production of Youngstown Christian Television. In this program, we seek to integrate the biblical record with the secular historical record and show where the two intersect and what influence one may have had upon the other. This not only helps us to understand what is happening in the Bible, but also gives us a greater confidence that what the Bible records for us actually did happen. Now, we are in the section of history we call ancient times. That is when we began at the beginning of history and of following on through the many different civilizations that we look at as being ancient history. And in particular, we're looking at ancient Egypt right now. We've spent several weeks looking at the different kingdom periods in ancient Egypt. Remember, the first kingdom period is called the Old Kingdom period. It's during that period that the pyramids were built, the Sphinx was built. And by the way, the pyramid was not built by slaves, certainly not the Hebrew slaves, they weren't there yet, but was actually built by artisans, possibly some of the agricultural population during the off-season. And then we have intermediate period between each of the kingdom periods. We go to the Middle Kingdom period, and it's during that time that Joseph arrived in Egypt, and we looked at the evidences for his presence there and what he accomplished. There was another intermediate period which included an invasion by the Hyksos people, who are Amorites. They ruled in Egypt for a time, and then as they were driven out, we entered the New Kingdom period. It is during this New Kingdom period that we encounter Moses. I won't go into all the history of that, we've already covered that. You remember that we ascertained that it was Amenhotep II who was the Pharaoh of the Exodus, and gave you some reasons behind that. If you've not seen that episode, go back and watch the couple of episodes before this one in the archives. Now, here is the family tree of Amenhotep II, and the reason why I'm revisiting this is because I recently read an article in the latest Biblical Archaeology Review which added some information that I did not know. That's the thing about history. There's always more to learn. And I keep updating my notes all the time so that it becomes a never-ending process. But remember that the family tree of Amenhotep II goes back to Ahmose, who is the one who drove out the Hyksos and thereby eventually enslaved the Hebrew people because they were related. They're both Semitic. And we move on down to Tutmosis I, Tutmosis II, Tutmosis III. Remember that Tutmosis II was married to his half-sister Hatshepsut because the royal blood only came through the queen. And so he was married to her, and she basically ruled for him because he was not mentally capable of doing it. Then when Tutmosis III, the son of Tutmosis II, but not through Hatshepsut, arrived on the scene, he was too young, so Hatshepsut ruled in his place, remember. And when he became of age, she continued to rule, which caused great consternation on his part. So that when she died, he had her name erased from as much as he could find. Now, one of the things that occurred during this time period is we have the arrival of Moses. Hatshepsut is the princess who brought Moses out of the Nile River and adopted him as her son. So he grew up in the royal palace of Pharaoh, and maybe even could have had a claim to the throne had Tutmosis the third not embraced it so strongly and then passed on to his son, Amenhotep II. So what relationship is there between Moses and Amenhotep II? This is one of the things I didn't really talk about too much before. But remember, when Moses arrives on the scene in Egypt, having been in Midian for 40 years, and God calls him to come back to Egypt to lead the children of Israel out of their slavery and out of Egypt. And have you ever thought, well, how did Moses have the temerity to go in to the throne? And how was he even allowed to come into the throne room of the Pharaoh at that time, who I believe was Amenhotep II? Maybe because he was known. It wasn't that long before, 40 years, that he had been there. And yes, he had run away, having killed an Egyptian for fear that Tutmosis III would have him put to death, being that Tutmosis III did not like, in fact, hated Moses' stepmother, adoptive mother, I should say, Hatshepsut. But Moses may still have been known. And in fact, what relationship was there between Amenhotep II and Moses? Well, Moses was his uncle, by some reckoning or another. So Uncle Moses comes in to see the Pharaoh. And what does Uncle Moses want? Well, you might be surprised to find that before Moses ever gets to Egypt, Moses is told by Yahweh that he will be elevated to the level of deity, at least in the eyes of Aaron and Pharaoh. For example, in Exodus 4:16, Yahweh says that he, that is Aaron, shall speak for you, Moses, to the people, and he will be as a mouth for you, and you will be as God to him. Or the word God there, as is translated in most English texts, is the Hebrew Elohim. And listening to the Bible Project recently, and I hope that you include that in your podcast, they were talking about the fact that the word God is not maybe a really good translation for Elohim, but it should be simply a supernatural being. Because there are places in the Old Testament where the name Elohim is used when it's not talking about Yahweh, God, but it's talking about either a supernatural being of some kind, or in this case, Moses being someone who is acting as a supernatural being. And so Moses is told that he will be an Elohim to Aaron. He will act as Elohim, and Aaron will be his prophet. The word, of course, Elohim is used of the Creator in Genesis 1, and the sovereign ruler over all the universe, but also, as I said, of lesser or even false gods. In this case, it appears that Yahweh is placing Moses in the role of authority over Aaron, who would then function as Moses' prophet. He will be a mouth for you. Later, when Moses is in the land of Egypt and seems rather reluctant to confront Amenhotep II with Yahweh's demands to let the Israelites go, Yahweh encourages Moses with the words recorded in Exodus 7:1, which says, "And the Lord said to Moses," or Yahweh said to Moses, "See, I make you as God, as Elohim to Pharaoh, and your brother Aaron shall be your prophet." Now, what was Yahweh indicating here? He would make Moses to be equivalent to a god or Elohim in comparison with Pharaoh Amenhotep II. This would put them on an equal level, since the Pharaoh was considered to be the god Horus. That Moses already had some status in Pharaoh's court seems evident from the fact that he was able to just stroll in like I mentioned before. It seems probable that Amenhotep II may have even remembered Uncle Moses, the adopted son of the Pharaoh's step-grandmother, Hatshepsut. Amenhotep II may have also remembered the particular circumstances of Moses' entrance into the royal household, which in itself carried certain profundities. You see, the story of Moses' birth closely parallels the account of the birth of the god Horus, one of the foundational myths of ancient Egypt, which first appears in Old Kingdom texts. Both infants are hidden by their mothers, in the case of Horus, Isis; in the case of Moses, Jochebed, in papyrus baskets among the reeds of the Nile Delta to protect them from the machinations of those who seek their death. In the case of Horus, it was Seth. In the case of Moses, it was Pharaoh Thutmose I. In both stories, an emphasis is placed on the mother nursing the child. This is stated explicitly in the case of Moses' mother in Exodus 2, 7-9, and there are numerous statuettes of Isis suckling baby Horus from ancient Egypt. And we'll talk more a little later about the significance of that particular image. Well, being the god Horus incarnate, each pharaoh was considered to have experienced the life of Horus himself. So the birth story of Moses is intended to demonstrate at least equality to Pharaoh, or possibly even authority to be Pharaoh. Meanwhile, because of the plagues that we'll be looking at that were brought upon Egypt, Pharaoh Amenhotep II is transformed from the god Horus to the god Seth, who is the deity of chaos and disorder. Another parallel to Horus is found in Exodus 4, when Moses is commanded by Yahweh to grasp the staff that had become a snake by the tail. Now, although this particular feature is not mentioned in its reenactment before Pharaoh, it must be assumed that Moses repeated this gesture, an action to be compared with the many portrayals of the young Horus holding snakes by the tail. Interesting, no? Therefore, the appearance of Moses before Amenhotep II had to be very disconcerting to the latter, for not only was Moses a rival for the throne due to his adoption by Hatshepsut, through whom the royal lineage ran, but also because of his close association with the god Horus, with real-life parallels to that of the god who was supposed to be embodied in the ruling pharaoh. And so you can imagine Amenhotep II being confronted with all this, what is going through his mind? Here's another hieroglyph of Horus, and you can see the snake is pictured above his head in this case. So there's a close association. Well, now let's move into the plagues. Here are the 10 plagues as we find them. Some of the names of the plagues or what is used in the plagues may differ in different translations, but here the 10 basically are. We have the blood, the frogs, lice, flies, pestilence, mostly the cattle, boils, hail, locusts, darkness, and then the slaying of the firstborn. Now, you might wonder, why were these plagues brought upon Egypt? Now, every plague brought upon Egypt by Moses was a direct attack upon some deity or deities or religious practice of the Egyptians. God gives us a clue to this back in Exodus 12:12, when he says to Moses, "Against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment." Most of the plagues were not unusual occurrences in Egypt, but were proved to be supernatural by their intensity, succession, and subjugation to Moses' command, and by the exemption of Israel from 7 of them. After the second plague, the magicians of Egypt failed to imitate Moses' miracles. Now, some of the gods against whom these plagues come might include, in general, the statue Amen. Remember the association of Amen with the arrival of Abram. And another thing I found out recently is that apparently associated with the god Amen are rams. And so those ram heads that we saw on the sphinxes outside of the temple were associated with Amen. And of course that could have come simply through the connection with Abram, who was a shepherd. So some very interesting connections here. So we have Ammon, we have, again, Isis and Horus, some of the main gods of the Egyptians. And I want to take a minute here to just look at this idea of the mother and child, because it seems to begin here, although we find it in Babylon as well, which we've looked at prior to this, Old Babylon. The goddess Isis is one of the more famous and popular goddesses of the ancient Egyptian pantheon. Isis is the wife of Osiris and the mother of Horus, often pictured this way. But also known as, in the Babylonian area, Semiramis and Tammuz. So the same concept is in that culture as well. And then we find it as Inanna, as the queen of heaven in Sumer. In Assyria, Ishtar has Bacchus. This is showing representation of the goddess Ishtar, winged and wearing a version of the horned cap of divinity. And then in India, there is the goddess Iswara, and in Asia, there is Cybele. In Greece, Aphrodite has the child Eros. In Rome, Venus has Cupid, which turns into Mary has Jesus. Notice the crown on Mary. Here's a summary picture of the different goddesses with their children, with their child, each child. And you can see that this connection has been carried on throughout much of history. Well, let's go to the first plague. The first one is the Nile turning to blood. And I'm not going to read all the scripture related to these things. You can look those up if you like, but you will remember the plagues as I delineate them here. Now, why, against what god was this? Well, you can maybe guess at this. Osiris was the god of the Nile, which gave life to Egypt. In fact, it was even said that the Nile was the lifeblood of Osiris. And so God says, okay, you believe the Nile is blood. I'll just turn it to blood. How would that be? Hapi was also a god of the Nile. Now, just going back to Osiris, just to remind us as to his history, according to the Egyptian mythology, the god Osiris was murdered by his jealous brother Seth, who hacked Osiris's body into pieces and scattered them into the Nile. Heartbroken, Osiris's wife, the goddess Isis, reassembled the pieces with the other gods' assistance, and Osiris was magically restored. He then went on to become the god of the afterlife. And so when Horus, when the Pharaoh dies as Horus, he becomes the god Osiris in the afterlife. And that's connected with the Nile River. Well, then here's Hapi, the father of the gods. He's the god of the Nile. Egyptians who lived in the Nile Valley worshipped Hapi more than they worshipped Ra. So that's the first plague. The second plague is the plague of frogs. Frogs swarmed on the land, Exodus 8:2. Okay, against what god or goddess is this? Well, the god, oh, by the way, can you imagine what it would be like to have that many frogs all over the land so that you are actually walking on frogs? Oh, it gives me shivers just to think of it. Because remember, after the plague was over, they gathered up frogs by the shovelful, shoveling up all these dead frogs. Oh my, what an awful thing. Well, what god was that directed against? Well, that was against the god Hecht, or spelled these different ways that you can see here. According to Egyptian superstition, he was the god who controlled frogs. And so Yahweh demonstrates that he is stronger than Hecht because he has caused frogs to swarm the land. Next we come to the plague in which dust is turned into lice. The priests of Egypt were careful to be free from defilement of insects while worshiping. Now, have you ever had lice? I haven't had it, but I've had to deal with it. Just in case you're not familiar, this is what a louse looks like close up. They create a lot of itching on the skin of the head, and they live in the head because it's in the hair that they lay their eggs, which we call nits. Oops, I don't know why that went past there. Nits. Have you ever been a nitpicker? I have. It's a tedious process. When my daughter was in elementary school, she got lice. And I remember spending about 8 hours one day going through her blonde hair, looking for these little white nits. Not something I'd wish on anyone. But the priests of Egypt were careful not to have any lice. In fact, they would shave their heads so that there would not be any lice available to be on their heads. And what does Yahweh do through Moses? He turns dust into lice. The dust that in the air, and there's a lot of dust in the air in Egypt, was turned into lice. And this is against the god Seb. He is the earth god, also called Seth or Geb. And so he was discredited through this plague. The next plague was swarms of flies or beetles. And this represented the emblem or the scarab of Ra. Well, I'll talk more about scarab later. I keep telling you, we'll come to it. But a scarab or dung beetle was a symbol of Ra, the sun god. And he was helpless before Moses and Yahweh. We see in chapter 8, verse 21. This is the scarab beetle god Khepri, who had the head of a fly and became a plague to them. And here's the scarab, close up in a picture. The next plague that comes upon Egypt is a cattle plague. The cattle became diseased with murrain in chapter 9, verse 3. Well, this is obviously against the sacred Apis bull, who was worshipped all over Egypt as a symbol of strength, fertility, and prosperity. And the bulls were being destroyed by this disease, as was Hathor, the cow god of fertility. And in addition, the sky goddess Nut was sometimes depicted as a cow. We'll talk more about Nut later. Next we come to the plague of boils. Now boils broke out on man and beast, chapter 9, verse 8 of Exodus. The sprinkling of ashes by the Egyptian priests was supposed to propitiate the god Seth. But the opposite took place as Moses sprinkled the ashes. This was also an attack upon Isis, who is the god of healing, and possibly Kudsu, the goddess of sex, if the boils afflicted the genital area. Whoops, went a little bit too fast there. The next plague is hail mingled with fire, probably lightning. In chapter 9, verse 18, and this demonstrated that the gods of the air were helpless, and that included several. That included the goddess Nut, that was also mentioned previously, and the god Shu, who is generally depicted as a man wearing an ostrich feather headdress. Sometimes he wore the sun disk on his head. And also Seth was the god of wind and storms. Also included Isis and possibly others. Here's Shu with his ostrich headdress. And here is Nut. Now, aside from her blue body, you might notice her posture. This is because of her particular function in the sky. Presumably she's blue because the sky is blue, and she represents what happens in the sky every day. As the sun rises, it is considered to be swallowed by her and goes through her mouth and into her body. And as it passes through the sky, we see the sun all day long. And at the end of the day, the sun is eliminated through the other end of her body. It's at this point that the scarab becomes important, because as the sun goes down below the horizon, it is the scarab god that, like a ball of elephant poop pushing it along, the scarab pushes the sun along through the earth all night long until it comes up on the other side in the morning and again enters into the sky through the body of Nut, the goddess of the sky. So that's the importance of the scarab and why he is so revered as the god who pushes the sun all night long. So hail and lightning was probably against several of the gods. The next plague is the plague of locusts. In 10:4 of Exodus, swarmed over the land as Serapis, the god who was supposed to protect the land from locust plagues, was proved to be a myth. Seth was the god of insects. Isis, in fact, in pictures of him, holds an insect, holds a locust. Next plague is a thick darkness covering the land. In 10:21, as the chief god of Egypt, Ra, representing the sun, and the moon goddess, Isis, were proven helpless. This also might be an attack again against Nut, the goddess of the sky. And then finally, the last plague is the death of the firstborn in 11:5 of Exodus. This defeated the divine Pharaoh himself. Pharaoh, who the previous Pharaoh had ordered the death of all male Hebrew babies. Now this grandson is being destroyed by God. Whoops. I'm accidentally hitting the button. I don't mean to. Sorry about that. God destroyed the heir of the throne. Pharaoh, the divine ruler who was supposed to be Horus, who thought he held life and death in his own hands, was defeated. This is also an assault against Isis, the protector, and Anubis, the god of the dead. Notice that in this picture of Horus, there is a two-part crown. The white part is the crown of Upper Egypt in the south, and the red part is the crown of Lower Egypt, including the Nile Delta. Together they show that Horus ruled all Egypt. During their reign, pharaohs identified themselves with Horus, and as I said before, after they died, they became Osiris. And so this final deathly plague, this plague of the death of the firstborn, in which all the firstborn of the land died, was a direct assault upon Pharaoh himself, demonstrating that he was no god at all. Now, next time, we're going to talk about Passover. You know that that's what protected the Israelites from this last plague, and we're going to be looking at it more in depth as we discover his story next time here at yctv.org. Make sure you join us then, and I'm sure you're going to be learning something that you didn't know about Passover and about the exodus of Israel from Egypt. One of the controversies that we'll be looking at is where exactly did the Israelites go, and where is the location of where they went. Lots of things to consider next time. See you then.
Join us as we learn from our host, William Henry, and discover that the story of the earth and our universe is really his story.